On December 21st, 1945, one of the most aggressive generals in American history lay motionless in a military hospital in Germany. He had survived North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, and the Battle of the Bulge. He had stared down Hitler's war machine won. Yet, weeks after World War II ended, General George S. Patton was dying from a car accident that barely injured anyone else. No enemy fire, no battlefield chaos. Just a quiet road and a death that still refuses to make sense. This is the story of why Patton's death was never fully explained. George S. Patton was never the kind of general politicians felt comfortable with. He did not soften his words, adjust his tone, or hide his beliefs to please those in power. He was outspoken, confident to the point of arrogance, and fully aware of his own abilities. To Patton, honesty was not optional, even when it created enemies. He believed that leadership required clarity and force, not careful phrasing or diplomatic silence. This made him admired by soldiers who valued strength, but feared by political leaders who preferred control and predictability. Patton's view of war was absolute. He rejected the idea that war could be carefully managed or morally sanitized. In his mind, war was brutal by nature, and the only way to end it was through total victory. Half measures, hesitation, and political calculations only prolonged suffering. He believed that decisive action saved lives in the long run, even if it appeared ruthless in the moment. This philosophy shaped every command he held and every decision he made on the battlefield. His battlefield record supported his confidence. Patton led aggressive, fast-moving campaigns that shattered enemy lines and demoralized opposing forces. His armored advances in North Africa and Europe demonstrated his ability to exploit speed, shock, and momentum in ways few generals could match. Enemies respected him, even feared him, because they knew he would not hesitate or retreat once committed. Victory, to Patton, was not merely a goal, it was an expectation. Yet Patton's intensity did not stop with the enemy. He often clashed with fellow Allied commanders, whom he saw as overly cautious or politically motivated. He openly criticized decisions he believed were driven by fear of controversy rather than military necessity. This made cooperation difficult and strained relationships within the Allied command structure. While others sought compromise, Patton demanded action. His controversies followed him everywhere. The most infamous involved incidents where he slapped soldiers suffering from what was then called battle fatigue. To Patton, psychological collapse under fire was unacceptable in a combat zone. He viewed it as a breakdown of discipline rather than a medical condition. These actions shocked the public and angered political leaders, reinforcing the perception that Patton was out of step with modern sensibilities, even as his military effectiveness remained undeniable. Patton also had a habit of ignoring or bending orders when he believed they were flawed. He trusted his instincts more than bureaucratic directives, and believed that rigid obedience could cost lives. This independence produced remarkable results, but it also made him unpredictable and difficult to control. Superiors tolerated this behavior during wartime because success mattered more than harmony. As long as World War II continued, Patton's flaws were overshadowed by his victories. His aggression was an asset, his bluntness a weapon. But when the war ended, the qualities that once made him indispensable became liabilities. In a world shifting toward diplomacy and political balance, Patton's uncompromising nature no longer fit. The warrior who thrived in chaos now stood uncomfortably in peacetime. No longer useful, he became a problem, one that history would struggle to explain. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the fighting in Europe finally stopped, but peace did not bring unity. The continent was physically destroyed, its cities in ruins, its populations exhausted by years of total war. Yet beneath this exhaustion, a new struggle was already taking shape. The alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany was beginning to fracture, because it had always been based on necessity rather than trust. Once the common enemy was gone, the deep ideological differences between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union quickly resurfaced. During the final months of the war, the Red Army had pushed relentlessly westward, liberating and occupying large parts of Eastern Europe. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and much of Germany itself fell under Soviet military control, while Western leaders publicly spoke of cooperation and post-war reconstruction. Moscow was quietly consolidating its influence. Communist-backed governments were installed, opposition voices were silenced, and political systems were reshaped to align with Soviet interests. What would later be called the Iron Curtain was already descending, even if the term had not yet entered popular language. General George S. Patton recognized this shift almost immediately. Unlike many political leaders who hoped wartime cooperation could continue, Patton viewed the Soviet Union with deep suspicion. To him, the end of Nazi Germany did not mean the end of tyranny in Europe. It merely marked the rise of a new one. Patton believed that Joseph Stalin's ambitions were no less dangerous than Adolf Hitler's, and he openly warned that the Allies had replaced one totalitarian threat with another. In his view, allowing the Red Army to dominate Eastern Europe was a strategic disaster that would eventually lead to another major conflict. Patton's concerns went far beyond private conversations. He spoke bluntly to fellow officers and, at times, to the press. He argued that the Soviet Union was exploiting Allied goodwill, using the language of liberation while establishing an empire of its own. Most controversially, Patton suggested that the West had missed a critical opportunity at the end of the war, with American and British forces still mobilized and positioned deep inside Germany. He believed the Allies were in a position to confront the Soviets before they became too powerful. This led to Patton's most shocking proposal: the idea of rearming defeated German soldiers and using them to help push back against Soviet expansion. To Patton, this was not about forgiveness or ideology. It was about military realism. He viewed former German officers as experienced professionals who understood the terrain and the enemy. In his mind, they could become a necessary tool to prevent Europe from falling under Soviet control. Two political leaders exhausted by 6 years of global war. Such ideas were unacceptable. The public wanted peace, demobilization, and stability. Any talk of a new conflict, especially one involving former enemies, seemed reckless and dangerous. Patton's blunt warnings clashed directly with diplomatic efforts to maintain cooperation with the Soviet Union and to present an image of Allied unity. What Patton saw as strategic foresight, others saw as destabilizing extremism. His words threatened carefully constructed plans and risked inflaming tensions at a moment when the world desperately wanted calm. Whether he was a visionary who saw the Cold War coming, or a general unable to adapt to peace, remains debated. But one thing is clear. In 1945, Patton was saying things that powerful people did not want to hear and that made him increasingly isolated in a rapidly changing world. George M. Patton's greatest battles did not end with the defeat of Nazi Germany. In many ways, his most dangerous conflict began after the war was over. Once the common enemy was gone, Patton found himself increasingly at odds with the very leadership that had relied on him to win the war. General George S. Patton was a force of nature, a brilliant, profane, and relentless warrior who led American armies to victory across North Africa, Sicily, and the heart of Europe. He was the general the enemy feared most. But there was another side to Patton, one that made him just as dangerous to his allies as he was to his enemies. And it's this side that leads us to one of the most enduring mysteries of World War II. Was his death truly an accident? To understand the controversy, you first have to understand the man. Patton didn't just clash with the enemy. He clashed openly with the Allied High Command. He saw the Supreme Allied Commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower, a diplomat, a man who valued political unity over military necessity. While Eisenhower was carefully managing alliances, especially with the emerging power of the Soviet Union, Patton had zero patience for it. He believed every compromise was a step towards the next war, not a path to lasting peace. His blunt criticisms put Eisenhower in a terrible spot. Here was one of his most famous, most effective generals, openly undermining the very foundation of the post-war strategy. And it wasn't just the Americans. Patton infuriated the British leadership. While London was focused on rebuilding a shattered continent and avoiding another global catastrophe, Patton was already sounding the alarm about a new threat. He believed the Soviet Union was a far greater long-term danger than a defeated Germany. He didn't just think it, he said it, loudly, and to anyone who would listen. He saw the Allies as naive, trading one tyrant for another, and he made no effort to sweeten his words for political convenience. Then there was his controversial stance on denazification in occupied Germany. The Allies were determined to purge every last trace of Nazi influence. To Patton, this was not only unrealistic, but counterproductive. He argued that many former German officers were professional soldiers, not die-hard fanatics. Removing all of them, he believed, would destabilize the entire region, creating a power vacuum that the Soviets would be all too happy to fill. To policymakers in Washington and London, this sounded dangerously close to sympathizing with the enemy. To Patton, it was just cold, hard pragmatism. Compounding all of this was Patton's relationship with the press. Unlike other generals who spoke in carefully crafted, pre-approved statements, Patton spoke his mind. It was candid, colorful, and often completely off script. His unfiltered comments would race back to Washington, causing chaos and concern. At a time when America was trying to project an image of unified, disciplined strength, Patton was a loose cannon, an unpredictable variable they couldn't control. By late 1945, the war was over, and the patience for Patton had run out. The hero who was once indispensable was now seen as a liability. The government didn't want a public showdown, so they chose a quieter path. Patton was stripped of his command of the Third Army and shuffled into obscure administrative roles. It was a calculated, humiliating sidelining of a man who had commanded vast armies and reshaped the map of Europe. But Patton wasn't a man to fade quietly into the background. He was scheduled to return to the United States, and that prospect terrified some in Washington. They knew he wouldn't just retire. He would speak out, write books, and give interviews. With his towering reputation, people would listen. In the fragile new world of the Cold War, Patton's voice had the power to challenge official narratives, question critical alliances, and stir up public dissent. For the architects of the post-war order, George S. Patton wasn't just a nuisance anymore. He was dangerous. December 9th, 1945. The morning was cold and heavy with fog in occupied Germany. The scars of war were still fresh on the landscape, but an uneasy peace had settled in. General George S. Patton, no longer commanding armies, was on his way to a pheasant hunt. He sat in the back of his U.S. Army Cadillac, a simple trip on a quiet day. The car moved at a modest, controlled speed. There was no rush, no emergency. Nothing to suggest the day would be anything but ordinary. Up ahead, through the thick fog, a U.S. Army truck approached. In a sudden, unexpected move, the truck driver made a sharp left turn, directly into the Cadillac's path. The general's driver had almost no time to react. The collision itself was not catastrophic. It was a low-speed impact, metal bent, glass cracked, but there was no fire, no violent explosion. In the chaos of post-war Germany, it was a minor incident. The aftermath seemed to confirm this. The driver of the Cadillac was not seriously injured. Patton's aide, sitting beside him in the back, also survived. The driver of the truck climbed out of his cab, shaken but unhurt. By all appearances, it should have been a survivable crash for everyone involved. Everyone, except Patton. In that single jarring moment of impact, Patton's body was thrown forward. His head snapped back with violent force. But here's where the story takes a strange turn. There was no skull fracture, no visible head wound, no sign of the kind of external trauma you'd expect. Yet the internal damage was catastrophic. His spinal cord had been severed. The man who had faced down tank divisions and survived the hell of modern warfare was paralyzed from the neck down in an instant. The medical teams were baffled. The injuries simply didn't seem to fit the accident. How could a low-speed collision, one that others walked away from, inflict such a devastating, fatal injury on a man as physically robust as Patton? There was no evidence of a major blow to the head, nothing to explain the precise, deadly nature of the damage to his spine. Yet, there he was, helpless. In the days that followed, Patton's mind remained sharp. He joked with his doctors and talked about the future. But then, complications set in. Blood clots, respiratory failure. On December 21st, 1945, just 12 days after the crash, General George S. Patton was dead. The official cause was a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that traveled to his lungs, resulting from the injuries he sustained. Case closed. Or was it? The irony was stark and unsettling. The war couldn't kill him. The enemy couldn't kill him. But a foggy road, a simple turn, and a minor collision did. The sheer ordinariness of it all felt wrong, and for many, that ordinariness was the beginning of a deep and lasting suspicion. The questions started almost immediately, whispered at first, then growing louder over the years. Why was Patton the only one to suffer a fatal injury in a low-speed crash? Why were the official reports on the accident so inconsistent? with some witness accounts seeming to vanish altogether. Why were key documents, including the full accident report, either delayed, missing, or later classified by intelligence agencies? And the biggest question of all, why was there no serious high-level investigation into the death of one of America's most important and beloved generals? In any other circumstance, the death of a four-star general would trigger a massive inquiry. In Patton's case, it was met with a strange and convenient silence. The story was quickly buried. As the years turned into decades, darker theories began to surface. These weren't just idle rumors. They came from people who were there, from intelligence insiders and historians who couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Some claimed the accident was deliberately staged, a perfectly executed assassination designed to look like a random tragedy. De motive? To silence Patton before he could return home and blow the lid off the Allies' post-war strategy, especially their relationship with Stalin and the Soviet Union. Whispers implicated foreign intelligence agencies who feared his anti-Soviet stance. Some even pointed the finger at elements within the Allied command, suggesting that Patton's own side wanted him gone. One former agent of the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, even went on record claiming he was hired to arrange Patton's assassination, and that the car crash was the chosen method. But concrete proof, there was none. No declassified file, no smoking gun, no deathbed confession. Only whispers, anomalies, and a deep, unsettling silence from the powers that be. So, why might the truth never be known? Perhaps because Patton's death was just too convenient. Think about the timing. The war in Europe was over. The fragile, terrifying new reality of the Cold War was just beginning. In this new world, stability was everything. Unity among the Western Allies was paramount. Reopening the investigation into Patton's death would have been a political earthquake. It would have forced questions that no one in Washington, London, or Moscow wanted to answer. It could have exposed divisions, betrayals, and uncomfortable truths. At the very moment the West needed to present a completely united front. So, the files remained closed. The questions remained unanswered, and the legend of Patton slowly faded into the mystery of his death. Officially, General George S. Patton died from injuries sustained in a tragic, but ordinary, car accident. Unofficially, his death silenced a powerful voice that refused to be controlled. Was it just a cruel twist of fate, a final, random act in a life defined by chaos? Or was Patton the very last casualty of World War II? A man who survived the guns of the enemy, only to be taken down by the politics of the peace that followed? We may never know for sure. And maybe, just maybe, that was the entire point. Thank you for watching. If you find these historical mysteries as fascinating as we do, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation.